Hi there. If you've seen part 1 of this article regarding the building of the model of the BR Standard Class 4460 tender locomotive, then you will recall that we said we were going to start with the buffer heads. I'm going to make all 4 buffer heads at the same time. 2 of them will be for the rear of the tender, and 2 of them will be for the front of the locomotive. So let's have a look then how these buffers were made. In this video we're going to make a start on one of the buffers, and all 4 will be made exactly the same. But firstly let's have a look at the first one that was made actually being spun in the lathe part way through its manufacture. Before we see the part spinning in the lathe, let's just have a look at what we are looking at. So basically we're going to make 4 buffers, and the pieces of steel I had were from a mill that I worked at about 32 years ago, so they're of sentimental value to me because that's the time my daughter was born. So with the 2 pieces of steel, I'm going to make 2 buffer heads from each piece of steel. That will give me 4 buffer heads. So what we're looking at currently is the first of the 4 buffer heads being made, and we can see that the main bulk of the material is sat in the 3-jaw chuck, and the buffer itself is being formed on the far end of the material close to the tailstock of the lathe, with the revolving centre in the tailstock of the lathe. We can see that I've started to turn the shaft of the buffer head and the rear of the buffer head, and I've also started to turn down the diameter of the buffer head itself to somewhere near a finished diameter. So both of the pieces of steel were put into the lathe in this manner to start with, and one end was turned as we see it in the lathe here. What I did then, I took that piece of steel out of the 3-jaw chuck, I wrapped some paper around the shaft of the buffer that we can see there, and reinserted the small diameter into the 3-jaw chuck. I then faced and centered the extreme end of the larger section, which was now pointing out towards the tailstock. I faced that, I centered it, I inserted the revolving center again, and then I machined down the new out-facing end to what we can see there. So effectively I had 2 buffers made at the same time, one on one end of the steel and one on the other end of the steel. The 2 buffers would then be separated in the middle, and I would end up with 2 separate individual buffers from the 1 piece of steel. 1 piece of steel would form the 2 at the rear of the tender, and the other piece of steel would form the 2 buffers at the front of the locomotive, so that the buffers in their own pairs, i.e. the back of the tender and the front of the engine, both came from the same material stock. So before we start the piece running in the lathe, it's just important to show you what's going on in this clip. We've now done further work on the inside of the buffer head. So we've removed the tailstock and its spinning centre, and we've put the piece of work inside the fixed steady to give it additional support away from the chuck itself. Now it's important to show you this because I don't have any filming of this particular setup other than this clip. All the rest of the filming of the making of the buffers was with the smaller section of the first buffer mounted in the chuck. So this is the only clip showing the full bulk material sat in the chuck originally. This is the first piece of steel that was ever turned for this 7¼ inch gauge BR Standard Class 4460 tender loco. This is the beginnings of one of the rear buffers of the locomotive which fastens onto the tender, which is what I propose to start. So there's the first piece that was ever machined up, and that's the buffer head for the tender. Still work in progress, as we can see. This is the first of 4 to be attempted to be made. 2 for the rear of the tender and 2 for the front of the loco. Give it a quick spin in the lathe. This clip is merely to show you the first piece ever of the beginnings of this loco. So before we have a look at the machining process, let's first have a look at some quick slides and establish how we've got to this position where we are currently with this fixed steady applied to the lathe. Moving on from what we can see here, the main stock was removed from the chuck. So here we've completed the internal and external features on the rear of the buffer head on this one piece of steel. So now we need to resight this piece of steel in the lathe. So we're going to put the smaller section of the buffer shaft into the lathe chuck. So the first thing I did was wrap some silver foil around the reduced diameter of the buffer shaft, so that when I put it into the 3-jaw chuck and closed the chuck jaws, the jaws wouldn't damage the face of the machined steel that I'd just completed. So now with the protected buffer shaft mounted in the 3-jaw chuck of the lathe, we needed to face the end of the larger piece of steel sticking out of the chuck. Then we needed to centre it with a centre drill, and then we needed to give it additional support once having done that with the revolving centre. Here we see the revolving centre pushed firmly up against the end of the stock material such that it can give it support. I then made a mark in the stock material where the rear of the buffer head would be when I started machining this new section. The workpiece is now securely supported between the 3-jaw chuck and the revolving centre, and we can see the face of the material starting to come off. And we can see the machining operation where the end of the buffer head will start. The material, taking about 10 thou passes, was machined down and down until the correct diameters were obtained. When the final pass along the main buffer shaft had been made, and it was a good smooth finish and to dimension, the top slides needed rearranging such that we could machine the 1.5-degree rake on the back of the buffer head. This meant that careful juggling would have to be made with the handles, as they were one on top of the other. If the machining operation was really hampered, you could remove the handles from the top slide and cross slide, etc., so that they didn't foul each other. On my lathe, the main carriage had to be locked off with a spanner on the back glideway such that my dials would be at the correct setting for me to do the machining operation. Obtaining the correct 1.5-degree angle for the tooling meant that I had to do some temporary markings on my lathe top slide such that I could read the angle that I needed. We'll go into how I did this later. The external diameter of the stock material will need machining down to a nice finish such that we can apply the next fixture to do the internal work on the buffer head. I needed to set up my fixed steady. When looking at the fixed steady, we can see that the top half would hinge open such that we can encompass the work within the main circle of that steady. We can also see at the very bottom of the steady that the steady itself sits on the lathe bed, and there is a clamp underneath on a bolt that will bolt up against the bottom of the lathe. Before we put the fixed steady on, we just need to clean off the lathe bed so that there's no damage to the lathe bed when it goes on. Firstly, we put the fixed steady onto the lathe bed with the clamp in line with the main lathe bed. Then we start to turn the clamp so that it locks underneath the lathe bed. When the clamp is fully at 90 degrees to the lathe bed, we can then tighten the clamp up with a spanner. This will ensure rigidity and alignment of the fixture to the lathe bed. With the fixture's movable jaws backed right out of the way, the top half of the fixture can then be swung over to fully encompass the workpiece. The tensioning bolt to the left of the fixture can then be swung up and tightened in place. With the workpiece supported by the 3-jaw chuck and the revolving steady at the other end, the 3 movable jaws of the fixture can be brought into place and into contact with the workpiece, giving it support. The jaws shouldn't be over tensioned, they should just be a nice contact sliding fit with the workpiece. Once the tension is correct, each of the jaws can be locked in place with the spanner and tightened up. The chuck can be manually rotated to ensure that the friction between the workpiece and the movable jaws isn't too much. A lubrication oil is applied to the contact point between the jaws and the workpiece. As seen here with the workpiece held in the 3-jaw chuck, suspended by the fixed steady and also supported by the live revolving centre in the tailstock, most of the external machining of the buffers could be done at this point. If the live revolving centre was in the way, that could be taken away and the machining performed with just the 3-jaw chuck and the fixed steady. The live revolving centre in the tailstock would definitely need removing for any internal work on the buffer head. Now we're aware of the setup that we're actually looking at, and we're a little more aware of what the pieces are, we can actually set about some machining. So with an understanding of the support and the setup, let's have a look at some machining. So here we are at the lathe, and we're machining what's going to be the 4th of the 4 buffers for this standard class 4. We can see that the material is held in the chuck, rotating, and it's supported by this steady here that we've got. So that's running in some oil down here just to give it lubrication as it's turning. As we can see, this is some old steel that I've had many years, and it's actually part of an old shaft. At some point it's had a prior use. It's got a keyway in it there and another little fixing drill hole there. I've had this some 30 some years, this steel just sat waiting, so I've decided to turn it into 2 of the buffers. The first of the buffer is here. This is the smaller shaft as per the photos that we've looked at previously, held in the chuck. And so basically, yes, going to machine a bit more off this, just turning it down. This will be the shaft, and this here will be the back of the buffer head, and this will be the front of the buffer head when it's finished. So let's crack on. So we're only taking like 10 thou cuts because of this keyway here, which is basically giving us intermittent cuts. I'll just put a bit of oil on there. It's not proper cutting oil, but it will cool the bit down a little bit. So as I say, I'm taking about 10 thou off each cut, which is 20 thou in total, but because of this keyway that we can see here, I don't want to go too mad, and I'm not sure how hard the steel is either, truthfully. There, the intermittent cut. The lathe tool also cuts coming back on almost a spring cut, if you like. Lengthy process and plenty to come off. So now, as you can see, we've got below the keyway, and I've just taken a 20 thou cut off, and it seemed to handle that quite well. But what I've got to bear in mind is, on the other end of this steel in the chuck is what's going to be a finished component, and it's just surrounded by a thin piece of paper to protect it from the chuck jaws damaging it. So I don't want it to lock up in the lathe or have any issues with spinning in the chuck. So I'm still going very cautiously with it, and of course we've got the heat, so I'm oiling this from time to time to make sure this is well lubricated, and giving it time to cool down as well between cuts, because it does get very hot, too hot to touch. Let's see a 20 thou cut. You can hear the lathe slowing down a bit as it's struggling with the cut. There should be two drive belts between the lathe shaft and the chuck head on this machine, but one of them unfortunately has snapped, so I'm down to one drive belt as well. So I'm really taking it quite steady, really, I suppose. Just moving the main carriage by hand. It's not automatically fed or anything. I could make it so, but I'm just doing it by hand. I like to get the feel of the job. And I'm moving the main carriage instead of the top slide. So that was a 20 thou cut. Right, so we're now down to the last 29 thou to come off. So I'm going to take 10 thou off, which should leave me with about 9 thou to come off. I've replaced the button tool with another one that was getting worn. So that should leave me about 9 thou up. Showing 11. .5. So we'll take the cut at that. Ten thou up. .11. So if I were to take 5 thou off of one side now, we should be somewhere near a bit of emery cloth, and that would put us at the same size as the existing buffer which I've made already.